Hi, folks. Welcome to Crisco's Corner. Hi, folks. Welcome back. And those of you that are new, welcome. This short piece from Fox News. And after this thing with Newt Gingrich concerning Biden, who's really the president, there's a little history on President Woodrow Wilson, who I personally believe is the worst president ever in the history of the country. Not Joe Biden, even though Joe Biden is coming in a close second. Who really is the president? And Newt Gingrich has some interesting thoughts on it. And then after that, it's going to be a little short. You'll see a little story concerning how Woodrow Wilson's wife was really the president for over a year when Wilson had a serious stroke and other medical complications. But let's watch this first.
You're wondering, Joe Biden, unsurprisingly, is heading back to the beach tomorrow to battle his beach chair. After a short trip on Air Force One, I wonder if Hunter will be on it. Probably.
Well, look, I thought his performance in Maui was so bad, he was so clearly out of it, that frankly, I think it's frightening. This is not about politics and scoring points. This is the commander-in-chief of the most powerful military in the world, and it's clear that at least half the time, he's just not there. I mean, month by month, his cognitive collapse is more and more obvious.
Now, here's the thing. Like he says later, and I believe this as well, I don't think Joe Biden even knows he's not making the decisions. Yeah, he has to sign everything. Yep, there's legal papers and documents and executive orders and all that stuff. He thinks he's setting the policy. Now, Newt Gingrich later says he thinks it's somebody else, and he's going to say who it is. But he thinks he's really setting the agenda, I guess is the proper term to use. When in reality he's not. He's just a placeholder. Just like Woodrow Wilson was when he had his stroke, which you'll see a little bit after this, a story on Mr. and Mrs. Wilson. Let's listen on.
The Associated Press just reported that 77% of all Americans, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, 77% now believe that Biden is too old to run for re-election. I suspect by next summer that number will be in the 90s, because once...
I don't think they think he's too old. I think they use that as the question. In other words, his cognitive abilities been greatly impaired. And nobody wants to. Everybody's got family, friends, maybe even themselves in part, that are having trouble as they get older. So they just use the age thing. Whether you like Donald Trump or not, and whether you think he's the biggest SOB in the world or the greatest thing since sliced bread, or somewhere in between, the guy's sharp as hell. Now, you may not like what comes out of his mouth, and I'm a Trump supporter, but he doesn't have any cognitive issues at all. So I think it's not so much the age, it's the impairment that's the problem.
This starts, it's just going to get steadily worse. He's clearly in cognitive decline. He's clear, in fact, makes me wonder who's making the real decisions at the White House. Because obviously Joe Biden is not. He's not capable of it.
Mr. Speaker, when you hear that number 77%, you said it could go higher. In the past, numbers like that really would have rattled the cage of a White House, and they would have said, well, maybe it's time to step away. We don't seem to hear any of that. So who is, based on everything you know about Washington, how things work, who is making the calls? Is it...
Now, if you'll see the thing later about Woodrow Wilson, of course, they didn't have the internet in the mainstream media like it is today, so it's harder to hide. But everybody knew about it. It was a well-known secret, as they say. The vice president knew Wilson's vice president, and everybody knew, but nobody said anything.
Is this a Joe Biden thing? Is this a chief of staff thing? Is this a... Who is it?
Well, first of all, one of the nice things about cognitive dissonance is he may not know the number, and it may not occur to him that it matters, and he's just going on with his life. You know, he's back onto the beach. He's relaxing. He's doing some bicycling. He has a pretty decent life, and it doesn't occur to him that all these other things are piling up in a way that will be an absolute disaster for the Democratic Party. My personal guess is that the driving force behind the Biden administration is Barack Obama. Obama is the only president since Woodrow Wilson to stay in Washington. And in Wilson's case, he stayed because he'd had a severe stroke.
Yeah, well, you'll see a little bit of story after that. Think about that for a minute. Wilson and Obama. In modern times, we'll say in the last, well, it's been about 100 years since Wilson was president. But we'll say in the technological age, i.e. television, so we'll say the 1950s on, he's the only president to stay in Washington after he was president. Now, some of them might have had homes here, but they had multiple homes. But Obama has a home in Washington itself. I believe he's the only president to do so, except for Wilson from 1919. 1920 was Warren G. Harding. But it's amazing to me. It really is. Didn't anybody notice that Barack Obama and his wife and family supposedly have a house in Washington, D.C., and I'm sure it's in the really elite section. God forbid they live with the peons. But, you know, it's interesting. Let's listen on.
And he couldn't be moved. So the fact that Obama's here all the time, the fact that his staff literally permeates the Biden administration, and Obama's really, really smart. I mean, whatever Biden's problems are at being kind of slow and cognitively decaying, Obama doesn't have any of those problems.
That's actually true, and I can't stand Obama, but the guy is no dummy. He's no dummy. He has charisma. He has stage presence. He's an excellent public speaker. Bill Clinton was an excellent public speaker as well. There's been a few, but certainly not Joe Biden. I mean, I know junior high school kids that would give better speeches than Biden.
And if you watch the administration, it's much more an Obama administration than, say, the Joe Biden of 10 or 15 years ago. This is a very radical, very left-wing administration.
That's true. I was a Democrat most of my life. In fact, I was a local elected Democrat from 2000, 2007. I was in city council here in upstate New York. And we used to joke about Uncle Joe, the dumbbell, like the dumb uncle that sits on the porch like in Petticoat Junction for your older people that know what that is. He's just harmless and a dope. Yeah, I mean, he's the one that pushed through the drug bill that put all kinds of African Americans in jail, and he was a hard nose. Can you think that 15 years ago, Joe Biden would have in the White House trans TikTokers and YouTube personalities? That makes no sense at all. So who's really running the agenda? He's right.
Deeply dedicated to policies that are close to crazy. There are policies across the board going at the idea that they might propose that Americans be limited to 2 beers a week. You know, this is the kind of petty nanny state interference that most Americans will find crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. Now let's take a look at a brief history of Woodrow Wilson and how Mrs. Wilson was, ipso facto, the first female president and first president of the United States who was unelected, I might add. Very much like the Biden situation. You think it's a coincidence they both are horrible, horrible presidents? I think not. Here we see an article you might find interesting. Was Edith Wilson actually America's first female president? Now, she was the wife of President Woodrow Wilson. I think arguably the worst president ever in the history of the United States. Makes Buchanan and everybody else even worse than Joe Biden because of the serious effects. But that's another video for another time. Let's read on. For almost a year, Edith Wilson took on the duties of the president following her husband's stroke, despite the fact there was a vice president ready to take over. And there's a picture of her. She lived to 1961, as a matter of fact, which I find amazing. So she was alive in my lifetime. American history, everybody thinks is so ancient, but it's not. On the evening of September 25th, 1919, Edith Wilson, the wife of President Woodrow Wilson and First Lady of the United States, found her husband on the floor of his bathroom in the middle of a stroke. Within a few weeks, he was completely bedridden, unable to take meetings or attend to his daily duties. Unwilling to hand the presidency over to Wilson's vice president, Thomas Marshall, for fear that it would crush her fragile Woodrow, Edith Wilson decided she would serve as proxy for the president until he was well enough to resume his duties. For the next several months, as well over a year, Edith Wilson went from FLOTUS to POTUS, becoming the de facto president. As we seen earlier, Newt Gingrich think the really de facto president is Barack Obama, and essentially running the country in her husband's absence. My understanding is Barack Obama is the only ex-president that still lives in Washington or has a house there. He has multiple houses. Prior to his stroke, the president had been in the middle of a political tour, traversing the length of the country to preach the importance of ratifying the Treaty of Versailles, which they went along with, and joining the League of Nations, which was crushed. League of Nations was the precursor to the United Nations. Wilson's tour had threatened to exhaust him, and though he insisted he was in perfect health, eventually the stress of the long hours and the mounting workload proved to be too much. Yeah, it takes a lot out of you to try to press millions of people that you're full of. Before long, the tour had been canceled, and Wilson was restricted to bed rest. Now, you got to remember, that's before television. It's before radio. All they had was newspapers and magazines and the videos they showed in the movie theaters. I think 1919, there were still silent movies and not talkies, but they still had newsreels that they showed news of the day with, like, subtitles. It was restricted to bed rest. Rumors swirled about the president's mysterious disappearance from the public eye, like he's just gone. Everybody thinks those are like caveman days. It's pretty modern then. And indeed, the White House did nothing to quell them. Same with Biden. According to recently uncovered doctors' notes, the president was suffering from extreme side effects. Almost his entire left side had been paralyzed, and he had become partially blind in the right eye. A few weeks after the stroke, he came down with a urinary tract infection. My understanding, he had influenza as well. There was a huge influenza epidemic at the end of World War I around the world and in the U.S. Read up on that. You want to see a horror show that makes COVID look like an allergy. After that, it was attack of the flu, worsened by his already weakened immune system. Yeah. However, at the time, the president's health was a complete mystery to the people. For all they knew, things in the White House were running smoothly. Does this sound familiar? And according to the schedule, and for the most part, they were. In the mornings, Edith Wilson would get up and begin her stewardship. She would use to refer to her relative takeover of the West Wing. She would attend meetings in place for her husband, and when information needed to be passed to him, he would insist that she'd be the one to do it. In the evenings, she would take all necessary paperwork back to the residence where Woodrow was presumably waiting and inform him of what he needed to know. The next morning, she would return the paperwork to its original owner, complete with new notes and suggestions. Yeah, I'll bet. Who was informing her? I didn't say anything about his speech, but let's read on. If it seemed like an odd arrangement, the people close to the matter didn't comment on it. They lined up at Edith's door, day in and day out, waiting for the notes that she passed between them and their leader. It's just a vessel for... You'll read the rest of the article. I'll do it slowly if you want to stop. About their marriage and, against being married. And there's a picture of President Wilson with his wife, Edith. But just one problem with Edith's stewardship. While the country had elected Woodrow Wilson, they had not elected Edith Wilson, the woman who is now effectively in charge. Nor, if Newt Gingrich is correct, nor do they give Barack Obama a third term. But at the time, the legislation in place that detailed presidential succession was vague, and it was. It was later corrected, I believe, under Harry Truman. It waited that long. And the only real outline what to do in the event of a presidential death, but not incapacitation. Woodrow wasn't dead, Edith argued. He was simply minorly incapacitated and just needed a hand which is more than capable of giving. She didn't want to give up being first lady, and she didn't want her husband not to be president anymore. On top of her claims, Vice President Thomas Marshall agreed, as Woodrow wasn't dead, he didn't need to take over the office. Now the laws have changed. I believe there's an amendment that takes care of something like this, at least swears in the vice president temporarily, like when a president goes under anesthesia or things like that. Oh, man, it's unbelievable. So there you have it, folks. It's a similar situation, but just different people. There she is. Maybe the first woman president of the United States. And here's a side-by-side picture I shown from President Wilson on the left, Biden on the right. My opinion, the two worst presidents in the history of the United States. And there's been some buttes, but these guys top them off. So Jimmy Carter is safe from that misery. But another little interesting factoid, both of these are Democrats. Go figure. So again, we asked ourselves, who is the real president? The nuts and bolts president, not the one that got sworn in. And like Speaker Gingrich said, maybe Joe Biden doesn't even know he's not really making the decision. He thinks he's being president. It's crazy. It's Looney Tunes. Anyway, folks, maybe someday, hopefully in my lifetime, because I like to find out, a couple of books will be written. Things will start to leak out over time. But we're going to see. We're going to see it. But I know it won't leak out before next November. That's for certain. So, whether you believed Joe Biden was elected or not, he is the president of the United States. He took the oath of office, but yet I personally believe he doesn't make the decisions. And that makes it incredibly dangerous. He's a Joint Chiefs of Staff and head of the military. There's Barack Obama and his old advisors running the White House for the rest of it non-military. Is that why there was a gigantic fiasco in Afghanistan and the withdrawal? Is that why all these things are failing? Because there's maybe 6, 8, 10 people, a panel of people that are really the president? Kind of sounds like the old Soviet Union communist bloc, or the communist committee, they used to call it, the committee. They decide what the country does, and it's like 25 people on this committee. Didn't work then either, and it's certainly not working now. I think this goes against the will of the American people, whether you voted for Biden or not. I almost said Obama, Freudian slip. Whether you voted for Trump or voted for Biden, this is totally against the Constitution and the rule of law. But yet, what's to be done? There's only one thing. He'll get pressure from Democrats to quit, and if he doesn't quit, if he's stubborn and digs in, you have to vote for someone else next year for president. And my personal choice is Trump. Whether you like him or not, this can't continue another 4 years. Will the country survive it? Probably. But it will be in terrible shape, and it'll take at least 2 generations to recover. And I want my family, my son, my daughter, my granddaughter to live in the same country that I grew up in. That's not a lot to ask, but I guess in today's society it is. Until next time, goodbye, God bless, and good luck.